Starting in
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hi, this is Veronica.
And I'm Studio Steve.
We are the Pod Sound School.
And this is PodBitz. PodBitz is a quick and easy way to digest the latest news and events in podcasting.
Learn about actionable tips to podcast like a beast.
Listen to our podcast recommendations.
And be in the know with what is up in the PSS community.
And we do it all live.
While the clock is ticking.
Unedited.
And raw.
So get those ears ready.
Crank those speakers up.
And let's dive in. Hey guys, welcome to another episode of PodBitz.
Hello everybody.
Here on Twitter. So, today we are excited about this episode. Just to remind you of the format of PodBitz. It's a 13-minute segment. We do it live on Twitter every Wednesday. And then after the 13 minutes, we stick around a little longer to answer questions and reply to comments.
Yeah, so last week we posted our first premium episode on Patreon. We're very excited. We wanted to share that with you today. And you can find it at podsoundschool.com/support us. And I did the research for this episode and it's so good. It's all about the different ways you can implement today to make money with your podcast. I put myself through the test and we are going to be exploring each and every one of those options. And so you don't want to miss out on this episode. Join us on Patreon.
Definitely.
Also, we reached 300 members on our Facebook community. Ooh. Podcasting for Buses. We're so excited. Oh my gosh, it's been such a journey to grow our Facebook community, but we're super excited, super happy. And with that being said, we wanted to give some shout outs for a couple of members of our Facebook group. And the first one is Michael Milstead. He has a podcast. It's called I Want to Speak to the Principal. And Michael is an award-winning principal and a teacher in Texas. How cool. Hi to our friends in Texas. I know we have a lot of listeners in Texas, right?
We do. Yeah. Hey, everyone in Texas.
Awesome. So, yeah. And another shout out we wanted to give is to our friend Ivy Sue, and her podcast is Non-Technically Speaking Podcast. She was communicating with Steven last week, and she had a few questions, right?
Yeah, so we really like it when people contribute and ask questions in our Facebook group. So come over there and do that, and we'll give you shout-outs and talk about you. But yeah, she's just starting her podcast and was worried because it wasn't showing up in Apple Podcasts. And that's totally normal. That can take some time for it to pop up in Apple Podcasts, which is why we always recommend doing a trailer first so that you have time for it to show up there before you start promoting your show. And then she was also worried about the reviews not coming up, and that's normal too. It takes about 24 hours for people's reviews to show up on Apple. And then also she asked any advice on how to launch and get featured. And so we decided to make that our tip of the week, which is right at the end of this 13-minute segment. So stick around and we will give you the tip of the week there.
Yes. And news for me, I'm going to be a panelist at the Outlier Podfest here in Salt Lake City. And I'm going to be sharing the panel with Sky Pillsbury. From Inside Podcasting. We are fans of Sky, even though I just murdered her last name. And I was a guest on my Immigrant Story podcast. So go and listen to my Immigrant Story.
Yeah, really cool podcast. And Veronica gets very vulnerable. So definitely
I share a lot of personal details of my journey coming to the United States. It's been quite a journey.
Okay. Well, let's get to our first segment.
Yeah.
This Week in Podcasting.
Okay, This Week in Podcasting. If you guys haven't heard or didn't catch wind of it, iHeartRadio celebrated their second annual podcast awards.
Last Friday, right?
Veronica actually hadn't heard of iHeartRadio.
I know, how embarrassing. I apologize for that. I'm a Spotify, Apple podcast kind of a gal.
Yeah, but iHeartRadio, very huge. I think they claim that they're the biggest, and they came from online radio and everything. And this seems to me to really just have been a podcast awards for the celebrities.
Yes. I was telling Steven, so this is like the Oscars for podcasting, and it kind of is a lot of celebrities and a kind of like big names in Hollywood.
Yeah, and that's, I think, what they're going for. that Will Ferrell kicked off the awards with some really funny stuff, talking about how he invented Apple in his garage. And then, Conan O'Brien, of course, with his podcasting venture lately, he won Best Comedy Podcast, which I'm sure there's a lot of mixed feelings about that in the comedy podcasting community.
Yeah, I just couldn't believe it.
But then also the podcast that did win the best podcast of the year was The Dropout. And that was Victoria Thompson and Taylor Dunn.
Yeah, the writing for that podcast is it's phenomenal.
So that was interesting. And then in other news, also CNN.
I was just make a comment about iHeartRadio and how something that I mentioned to Steven when I was reading the article is how they should include a category for indie podcasters.
Yes,
I just don't see
really
why indie podcasters are excluded from this big name kind of award ceremonies.
And that would be a really simple thing to instate.
I know, like why not shedding the light on us indie podcasters?
Yeah, I mean,
we're hurt.
I know I was.
Sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
Oh, fine. No, I interrupted you with the other news. CNN is planning up to 12 new podcasts. I got this from the Podcast Business Journal. If you haven't subscribed to their newsletter yet or checked out their website.
Oh, this is so exciting.
And so they are including between 8 and 12 new podcasts in this. So it'll be interesting. Just news podcasts. Again, more and more radio, more and more news personalities are coming over to podcasting. And so that was good. And then, hey, did you know that Twitter has a podcast?
I have no idea.
Yeah, they do.
The world's coming to an end. Just kidding.
It comes from the creators of Twitter.
Is that they don't read the tweets that crazy people post.
Yeah.
Let's put it that way.
Or not the creators of Twitter. It comes from Twitter Careers Department. And it's called #Building Characters. And every episode these recruiters at Twitter talk about launching a career in tech.
Oh, okay.
So it's pretty interesting.
So it's more like corporate.
Yeah, I don't know, and I haven't listened to it yet, but I just thought that was interesting.
It would be funny to have a podcast with people reading the different tweets, funny tweets and stuff like that. Crazy tweet.
I know, Crazy Tweets podcast. That's actually a really good idea. Somebody should steal that.
If somebody wants to do it.
That one's up for grabs. And then last week we talked about the Apple Podcasts and Spotify war. There's been a lot of articles, a lot of misunderstandings, a lot of controversy. The Chartable blog kind of put out a different article, and we'll leave the link in this episode's description. And they're saying that Apple is still the heavy contender. But let's move on to our next segment.
This week in your queue.
Okay, this week in your queue, what have you got for us,
Okay,
Veronica?
so for this week, my recommendation is the Savvy Social Media Podcast with Andrea Jones. I interviewed Andrea a couple of weeks ago, and she's a social media expert. She is so good. I've been listening to this podcast because I wanted to learn more about LinkedIn. So in her podcast, you can find her covering different social media platforms like LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, Pinterest. So that's why I just love this podcast, because you can get informed about the different platforms and has very useful tips, actionable tips that you can implement right away.
And then my podcast in my queue this week came from Inside Podcasting. Also a link you can find in this episode's description. And it's called Hunting Warhead. And it was a really great recommendation. It's in 2016, a Norwegian journalist and an ethical hacker went looking for the operator of the world's biggest child abuse site. And the truth was...
sounds so interesting.
Yeah, it's crazy. And I'm only an episode into it, but definitely go give that a listen if you're looking for something. And it's very well produced. Really cool podcast. So, and that's great.
Another great podcast about social media is the Shine Online podcast with my friend Natasha.
And with that, I think, why don't we move on to the tip of the week?
Tip of the week.
Yes.
Tip of the week.
Wait till I tell you everything.
Okay, for the tip of the week, like we mentioned in the intro, many people don't know about the page that Apple has put together about marketing. Although it's pretty general stuff, it can be really helpful to read through, especially if you want Apple to feature you. And in the article, there's tons of tips about raising your chances. So you can find the article at podcaster.apple.com. And in addition to that, when it comes to being featured, many people don't know that you can actually reach out to Apple and ask them to feature you. And, back just a little bit ago, you would actually just contact them via podcast support at apple.com and ask them to forward your message to the editorial team. But now they've made it easier by putting together a Apple Podcasts promotion request form. And that's how you can get a hold of the editorial department. But this link isn't a public link. So to get this form, you will still have to email Apple at podcastsupport@apple.com. And in your email, just say, hey, is there a way I can contact the editorial department to request a promotion or request that my podcast is featured? And they'll send you that link over. And that's one step in the right direction. And that is a really cool link when they do send that to you to look at, because that guides you through the specific things that Apple really wants.
They ask for different things, right?
They ask for a lot of different questions, and then it kind of gives you insight into what drives the editorial team's decisions to actually put a podcast on the new and noteworthy or to put it on one of the new feature sections.
No, it doesn't guarantee that it's going to happen.
Not at all. No, but it does put it in front of the editorial team. And if you've done your homework and if you've actually qualify and your podcast sounds good, then you're good to go. All right. Well, that does it for this episode of PodBitz.
That went by fast.
Yeah. So tune in on Friday for a very interesting episode with Taylor Tiemann, and she is an IP attorney in LA, and Veronica just interviewed her.
Yeah, we talked about IP, copyright, trademark, and publicity rights in the context of podcasting. So if you have a podcast, you don't want to miss out on this episode because you want to be in compliance with these things to avoid any legal issues in the future. Links to the things that we mentioned during this episode will be added to the description of this episode. Also, follow us on Instagram and Twitter at PodSoundSchool.
Yep.
Follow me at Instagram.
Yep. And until next time, you guys, happy
Happy
casting.
casting.
Sometimes all a school needs is a little facelifting. Laboratories functionally designed for the student's use. The new miracle of modern tools for instruction.